Thanks for a unduly generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Well, any excuse to get to Nashville is always a good thing. As was noted, I'm neither an entrepreneur nor a scholar of entrepreneurship, so hope you'll forgive me for just about everything I get wrong today. I am a political scientist by training. In universities, I almost always teach public policy or education, neither of which necessarily requires that I actually understand what the heck I'm talking about when unlike entrepreneurship, where it actually matters if you get it wrong. What I want to chat with you a bit today is the role of higher education in all of this. Not higher education just as a home for us to do scholarship, but the interaction between higher education and entrepreneurship, and particularly why it is that the institutions that we work in and that we're familiar with may not be particularly well suited to the challenges of instruction and research going forward, and what role in particular you all are well positioned to play in facilitating and advancing that kind of rethinking and reinvention. What I'm going to do, y'all are quite lucky, because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A, I'll move on the brisk side. So we will spare you my long digressions on the University of Bologna and related issues and the history of higher ed, and we will try to move to the relevant, meaty stuff much more quickly. What we forget frequently when we talk about higher education, we talk about university, we talk about teaching, is that so many of our assumptions about what higher ed can and should do and what it should look like are a function not necessarily of a rational or thoughtful or creative weighing of the tools at our disposal and the needs we're trying to meet, but because this is the way it has always been done. If you wanted to learn from Socrates 2,000 years and change ago, there was a reason you had to sit at his feet. If you were more than about 40 feet away, you would have no idea what he was saying, right? A Socratic dialogue would have been like, yo, Socrates, suboptimal. So we created a notion of learning at the feet of the teacher. Perfectly reasonable, in particular because the only way you were actually going to communicate the scholar's thoughts other than orally was by, penning these on a papyrus roll, which you could do one or two, but you're probably not going to move 10 or 20,000 units. So you're dealing with a relatively limited opportunity. Half a millennia ago, a guy named Gutenberg came up with his notion of the printing press. It changed our ability to communicate and store knowledge. And what we started to see was through most of the Dark Ages, and this is one of these riffs you're getting spared, so you're lucky, most of what we think of as higher education today took place, in fact, under the auspices of the church. In monasteries, where what you had were disciples who would preserve manuscripts by copying them by hand, frequently trying to gild them and dress them up in the process. The printing press changed those dynamics. You could now build these things called libraries at many institutions and at scale, making available broadly and widely the opportunity to learn without person-to-person interaction. But that was pretty much as far as the technology advanced until, say, the last 25 years. Think about this. When we built out the American community college system, post-war years, 1945 to the early 70s, say, at that time, distance learning still meant you got in your car, you drove to the P.O. box, you got the blue booklet that was sent by some diploma mill, you took it home, you typed out your answers by typewriter, and you mailed it back. That was the state of technology in the mid-70s. We now have all kinds of tools at our disposal that we frequently, I would suggest, massively underutilize. Now, we have a bunch of presumptions that have been institutionalized about what university should look like. I'll simply say, and I think this is an audience thing to appreciate, historian Gerald Gutek has pointed out that perhaps the first university kind of charter in its current form was University of Bologna in 1158 by Emperor Barbarossa. At that time, the institution of the university was not the building, it was not the facilities, it was not all of the logos and sports teams and everything else that goes along with it. The university referred to a function. It was the community of scholars and students. And one of the things Gutek has pointed out was this actually put the scholars in a terrific bargaining position, because having a university was a generator of wealth and prestige for a community. And if the scholars felt ill-treated by the local church or local leaders, if they had reputation, they were in a position to move to a different community. So what you actually had was a dynamic negotiation, which an ability that we lost once we became place fixed. Although on the other hand, we see that the NFL still exploits it beautifully today. So there's this notion that the university has ceased being a function, a dynamic relationship between teachers and students, and has become an institution and a place. And once you get that institution and that place, the question becomes, how do you control it? And today we have settled, there have been a variety of forms over time. Today we have this mix and match hierarchy, which varies dramatically from your local community college to Stanford or Notre Dame. But the commonality is that we tend not to think very much about why they should be different, how they should be different, or how do we exploit these in terms of delivery and purpose. Higher education is not for one thing. Higher education is for a bunch of things. But when you listen to our discussions today about creation of university centers, about higher education accountability, about utilization of technology and alternative delivery, we tend not to draw particularly sharp or thoughtful distinctions about the purpose. Are these meant to be primarily research institutions? Are these meant to be primarily vocational institutions? Are they meant to be what have you? And the answer is that for different institutions, the answer should probably be different. But of course, the way that we have written state funding regs, the way that the feds tend to craft their guidelines, the way that we chase philanthropic dollars, tends, whenever possible, to blur some of these distinctions. So we'll get back to this in just a moment. Now, let's just talk a bit about the context in which all this is unfolding. First off, it's important to remember that American higher education has undergone a revolution just in the last half century. At the dawn of World War II, one American in 10 out of the adult population had attended some college. 1 American in 20 had completed college. Today, more than half the adult population has attended college, and almost a third has completed college. We're talking about a fundamentally different marketplace, which means there's lots more degrees, which means that we have seen a steady explosion in clients for colleges and universities. If you just compare to 1980, for instance, you'll see that the number of degrees issued has nearly doubled, and the same is true when it comes to associate's degrees. And along with this has been a pleasant and hefty expansion of public support. State and local governments today provide close to $85 billion in direct assistance to public institutions. There's more than another $100 billion that comes to help finance scholarship and student aid. All of this has made possible a steady and consistent increase in the resources available in the education space. What has explained all of this? Well, one of the things that's explained it is, as Claudia Golden and Katz pointed out in their recent book, is that we've seen a steady increase in the returns to college. This only shows it going back 35 years, but what they've argued in their recent book, Race Between Education and Technology, is that what we've seen during the 20th century is technological advances, the shift from an agricultural to an increasing service and technological industrial base has meant that there is a greater premium both on the skills that universities and colleges teach, but also on the sorting that they do for employers ahead of time to simplify the recruitment process of individuals who are able to function in a professional environment. So what we see is, while essentially average income has been declining in real terms for everybody without a four-year degree, what we've seen is actually, particularly in the last 25 years, a not negligible increase in the returns to the four-year degree. Now that's one piece of the context. Second piece of the context is colleges aren't always doing what we think they're doing today. First off is we're spending a huge amount of time doing remediation. And it's not at all clear that four-year or even two-year institutions are necessarily well-equipped or have the cost structure in place to handle lots of remediation due to the fact that the K-12 system is sending on students to college without even a basic mastery of skills, particularly when it comes to literacy and numeracy. Second piece of context is colleges aren't always doing what we think they're doing. First off, keep in mind that only 1 in 4 students at most, and this is if you count generously, are actually going as residential students to four-year colleges. 75% or more of American students, that is not their collegiate experience. For most of us in this room, I'd venture to guess, we probably spent 4 years in residence at college, because that is the vast majority, if you look demographically, at the folks who go into both professional schools and also into academia. That is not the normal higher education experience. And the question is, how do we serve that other 75% of students as cost effectively and usefully as possible? Other thing is, even for students who do come in residence, the college experience isn't necessarily what we envision in the back of our mind. NSSE, the National Study of Student Engagement, reports that more than a third of first-year students in the humanities, for crying out loud, report that they've never had a conversation with a professor about any of the assignments outside of class. So sometimes when we romanticize the importance of trying to create the liberal arts experience, we forget the reality of what so many students are experiencing. Second reality on the ground in terms of how universities are shifting is we've seen in the past 40 years what's generally referred to as the adjunctification of the professoriate. In 1970, 3/4 of higher education jobs were tenure-track faculty. Today, it's less than half. Now, this is partly because of cost structures, it's partly because of cost pressures, it's partly for a variety of reasons. I'll submit that one piece of it is because we have been profoundly unthoughtful about retooling job roles in higher education. Just like any dinosaur industry, whether you're any dinosaur manufacturer, whether you're General Motors or Bethlehem Steel, if you fail to find ways to accommodate changes in the productive technology, you wind up getting steamrolled, and you wind up just having to carve with meat cleavers. That's, I think, what we've seen in higher education, because we have not rethought how we allocate faculty responsibilities, how do we understand the faculty job. What we've simply found ourselves with is fewer and fewer conventional researcher teachers and more folks hired on the cheap. Part of that brings us to the research question. I said at the beginning, I said at the outset, that different universities have different purposes. There's about 4,200 post-secondary institutions in the United States. About 380 of them have PhD programs, less than 10%. Yet, we are very uncomfortable most times talking about the fact that more than 90% of higher education that doesn't have PhD programs, that for some large number of these institutions, research is probably peripheral to their mission. For some large number, I'm submitting, of the 4,200 institutions out there, they are primarily instructional institutions. Yet, we don't define jobs that way. Even in institutions which are explicitly charged with being instructional, say community colleges, we find that faculty are evaluated and hired in part on the fanciness of their degrees rather than their ability to teach. We find that they are monitored in terms of publication. And what we have seen, particularly with the availability of cheap publishing technologies in the last 35 years, and the ease of writing and doing research with a PC versus punch cards and a typewriter, is we've seen an explosion of publication in which more and more is published that is read less and less. So, for instance, over the last 50 years, we see that English faculty research publication, because we know that we're constantly pushing the frontiers of knowledge in English, has increased. Right? We're not talking about new chemical compounds here. Right? We've gone from 13,000 publications a year to 72,000 publications a year. I'm not suggesting that I know which of those publications are valuable, but I am suggesting that I think 72,000 is probably past the point of diminishing returns, and that we might actually want to see institutions where those faculty were spending more time teaching English and less time writing the 72,000 publication. And if that's the case, it means that perhaps for some of those roles we actually don't necessarily want or need PhDs and the wage premiums associated with it. Maybe what we want are former journalists who've been laid off by the New York Times, Or maybe we want people who are working journalists and editors who are teaching in a part-time role. What I'm suggesting is we need to rethink the assumptions. Meanwhile, for instance, book sales by English faculty now hover around 300. That's including the institutional purchase, right? Which is about 240 of that, I'm guessing. Meanwhile, Lawrence Martin in Academic Analytics points out that in the 380 PhD programs, 20% of faculty did not publish a single thing in the most recent 3-year window. They didn't write a conference paper, they didn't write an article, they didn't write a book, they didn't write anything. On the other hand, because of the protections associated with research, such as tenure, there is no feasible, meaningful way for department chairs or provosts to actually go after the 20% of researchers who are doing no research and either force them to actually teach more or reallocate those resources to other instructors. Second piece of the environment in higher ed, of course, particularly at major institutions, is the dominant role of athletics. All I'll point out here is that one of the reasons we tend to treat athletics as sacred cow, I used to live in Baton Rouge, so believe me, I mean, I used to teach at the University of Virginia, so I know the ACC, and one of the reasons we teach a sacred cow is because it's fun. But the other thing is there's this impression out there somehow that men's basketball and football are generating revenues, which are subsidizing the rest of the sports and which are subsidizing the university at large, and that's simply not accurate. Only about 20% of Division I men's basketball and football actually generate money. Most of them run at substantial deficits. So not only are they not covering the rest of the athletic programs, in more than 3/4 of institutions, they're actually being subsidized out of other revenues. All of this creates pressures, of course, in terms of expectations and making it more difficult for universities to reinvent themselves and what they're doing. All of this is particularly critical because the good times are probably starting to shift. Right now, many of you are in public institutions. You're well familiar with the funding cliff that's approaching. One thing to keep in mind, of course, is that because real estate is assessed typically on a rolling 3-year schedule, that if residential's bottoming now and commercial real estate's bottoming next year, states are probably going to be hurting probably through 2013, 2014. That's the Rockefeller Institute's projections, upstate New York. And of course, the stimulus, unless more money comes out to the states, is slated to end right now in 2011. When Public Agenda surveys voters about if states have to cut back in a recession, where should they trim? First choice is transportation. Second choice, way up there with its head kind of up and exposed, is higher education. More than 50% of voters say cut higher ed if you got to cut. If we look at growth in expenses relative, say, to medical inflation, which we talked about a lot, or certainly related to energy or the CPI, we see that higher ed's actually had a really terrific quarter century. When you ask voters about this now, half of them say higher ed should be overhauled in their state. 56% say colleges could be just as good with less money. None of this stuff's necessarily, necessarily tells you which way the wind's blowing, but at least suggests, I think, the urgency of thinking outside the box a bit. And the final question is that I would argue right now higher ed's not doing a great job at what we want it to do. Well, this is just kind of a fun illustrative figure. In terms of who's actually going to college, if you look at folks who have math scores in the bottom 1/3 of students on the SAT or other math assessments, but have but are in the highest quartile of family income, you will see that they go to college, that they complete college about 30-odd% of the time. If you look at folks who have in the highest third of math scores, but are in the lowest SES quartile, you see they actually complete college at a lower rate than the dummies with more money. This is actually not great marketing in terms of getting public support for higher ed. Second interesting fact here is if you just look at how college completion rates by Barron selectivity go from non-competitive to most competitive colleges, there's a real question here about how much value institutions are adding beyond what the students are bringing to the table. So your Berkeley's and your University of Texas's, 88% of students are completing within 6 years. You get down to your non-competitive and your less competitive institutions, fewer than 40% of students are actually finishing in 6 years. So that means students who are showing up on campus this fall, in 2016, Only slightly over a third of them will actually have a degree. The other two-thirds will have borrowed money and not finished. Again, this suggests, I think, some real problems. What does all this mean? Well, it means there's opportunities. I think that means there's a need to do better, and there's enormous opportunities for transformation. We have new tools at our disposal, a raft of technologies that we've used to revolutionize business domestically and around the world in the last 20 years that I think we are putting to poor use. We have a variety of needs, I'm suggesting, that are unmet in terms of poor but talented students who are not getting college degrees, students who are going to less competitive institutions who are not getting their degrees, students who do not want to live on a four-year campus but want a more cost-effective alternative. And I want to suggest that there's opportunities for new delivery models. I want to move through this, I'm going to fly through this pretty quick so we can get some questions. First off, we talk a lot about online learning. Let's just be clear on what it is. There's about 4 million students today who are taking at least one course online. There's about 18 million and change students enrolled in all elements of higher ed. So we're talking somewhere over 20% of students. And online enrollment is growing at more than 10 times the rate, give or take, of traditional enrollment. Now, what are people studying online? You look at this. People can try really hard to torture some meaning out of these breakouts. I tend to frown on that. I think they're just kind of cool to look at. But what we see is, for instance, engineering, you're seeing less online delivery, and you're seeing much more in things like general studies and the health professions. Basically, I think one of the things this tells us is that there's a recognition, both on providers and students' part, that some instruction lends itself to online and some doesn't. Duh. All right. Now, one of the ways we've tried to leverage online higher education, some of y'all may remember this, Columbia University headed up a consortium of a couple schools about a decade ago called Fathom.com. We pumped $30 million. It was going to be a for-profit brand created by Columbia and a couple partners to deliver online higher education at scale. It was going to leverage their names. It was going to leverage their faculty. It failed miserably. It was like the new Coke of higher ed. And part of the problem here is it was the same folks with their same notion of what the students out there want and the same notion of what's useful and functional trying to package Columbia University Fizz into a new model, right? Ignoring, say, everything that Clay Christensen has ever argued in Innovator's Solution or Innovator's Dilemma, right? The notion that the way we might want to use a disruptive technology like online learning is not to go head-to-head with the Ivies or with four-year institutions or to displace research, but that we might want to use it for is credit recovery programs, that the power in online education might be just-in-time delivery for people who are trying to get RN degrees, that we might be able to use it to reduce the number of campuses at community colleges that have to have geographically scattered around the state so we can redirect those resources to strengthening good programs. This is stuff that we don't do because this is not how public institutions generally think, because they've got folks in the state legislature who each of them likes that community college campus in their district, because they've got boards that are risk averse, because they've got alums who give to particular programs, and because they have cross-subsidy structures. And, you know, this is an easy crowd to talk about this to. If there's an outfit called Straighter Line that is now offering we'll actually get them in a sec. I won't even get ahead of myself. So one is to think about using online technology as a tool. Second is that there's actually huge opportunities to re-engineer the way we go about delivering schooling today. There's an outfit called the National Center for Academic Transformation. Carol Twigg, some of you may know her. They've worked with 30 institutions redesigning courses so that rather than having full-time expensive faculty, for instance, teaching 25 students, they have, in a series of lectures, they have one faculty give that lecture to 250, and then they take the cost savings, they use them to hire associated faculty or practitioners or to pay graduate students well so they can actually run them through 6 weeks of intensive training, and then have them do hand-holding and develop intensive software that actually allows students to do much more on-your-own pace tutoring, reduced cost by an average of 40%. Virginia Tech reduced costs for some classes by up to 75%. The performance results in terms of completion, in terms of performance on benchmark assessments, in terms of any of the standard metrics that we use, were all equal to or superior to the performance under the more expensive models. So there's huge opportunities here for rethinking, but again, all of you are higher ed. I don't need to give my spiels about internal higher ed politics. So there are some new models out there as well. There's this outfit called Straighter Line. What they do is they string together a series of remedial and basic instructional courses. They have 16 offerings. Students can either enroll for $399 a course, or it's a subscription model. You can pay $99 a month for all you can eat. They have, none of this stuff was built from scratch. What they are is just a smart intermediary. We've seen this story a million times before. They use the Blackboard infrastructure. They use third-party assessments. They use prepackaged instructional curricula. And they just assembled it and marketed it. What they're selling for $399, the University of Virginia and University of Maryland are selling for about $1,400. Not that it cost University of Virginia or University of Maryland $1,400 to do an online course in general math, but that's how much it costs if you show up on campus and use facilities and use all the other space. So that's how much we charge. And that other $1,001 then goes to cross-subsidize research allocations for faculty or the Campus Humanities Center or something else. So what we see, of course, is because these costs can't be broken out and because they're not transparent, we wind up with these huge and dysfunctional subsidies which get in the way of solving problems for people who don't necessarily want to come use all of University of Maryland facilities, but just by God want to get their degree so they can go out and get a better job. Western Governors University, which some of you may have heard of, operates in about, I forget, Mendenhall told me, I think it's 18 states nowadays. Same thing. They say, look, rather than actually count from how many, from the 16 courses you need for a 2-year degree, let's think about what you actually need to pass an RN certification. And let's build the requirements around that, and that becomes the instructional model. And if we can do that in 11 courses, and if we don't need as much seat time as we used to need, so be it. So it becomes a question of how do we prepare students for the jobs they want to get. Now, Mendenhall, who runs WGU, will be the first to tell you that this is not a substitute for Ohio State. If we're talking about institutions whose function is to generate research and for whom there are general developmental externalities, that's a different question. But if the object is to try to serve students so they can get a vocational credential that'll let them get a job, we don't need all of the overhead and cost structure, right? This is not a new story. This is JetBlue, this is Southwest. This is a story we've told a million times. It's Dell, for heaven's sake. So what's this mean? It means at least 4 things. One, we've got to rethink delivery systems. What does it mean to be a university? What does it mean to be a deliverer of instruction? Flip side of that is how do we hold them accountable? Last thing we need is a bunch of fly-by-night snake oil salesmen stealing from folks. So how do we think differently about accreditation? How do we think about accountability to make sure that students have have a good sense of whether or not they're going to be given their money and our money when it's subsidized and federally, and federally insured over to providers. Second is rethink the audience. You know, a line that gets said a lot at K-12 conferences nowadays, and I think it's good to keep in mind, is everybody always likes to say we should pay teachers like rock stars. And the obvious response is, you know what? If Bono was playing to arenas of 27 people, he'd be paid like a teacher. If you want to be paid like a rock star, we've got to actually deliver the economies of scale that we can generate enough revenues to pay you that way. So as long as we're thinking about faculty's audience as being the 30 or the 300 students in front of them, we're dramatically limited in terms of what we can pay them. So a huge question here is, who is the audience? A fellow named Doug Lynch, who's the vice dean at the UPenn Ed School, has been working with Croatia. He's selling them on the idea of university in a box. They want to bring in American know-how and learning. He says, tell you what, rather than find a university partner, give me a vacant building, we'll pipe in everything you want from 600 partner institutions. You guys can choose and pick your faculty. Why the hell do you need to tie yourselves down to geographic monopolies? That's a product of a time gone by. So our audiences don't need to be restricted to folks on campus or even folks who actually happen to be subscribing to a narrowly defined campus online delivery system. Question is, how do we learn, say, from the teaching company so that we create opportunities for great faculty to to fulfill their potential and to be rewarded for what they're doing. Third, we got to rethink the technology. We get very excited when campuses start to make available laptops or when faculty start to get on Twitter. But the question is not, how do we take the technologies out there and then tack them on to what we know how to do, right? The question is not, how do we use these as sustaining innovations? The question is, how do we use these to rethink our cost structure, to cleave off anachronistic functions and open the doors? And finally, how do we rethink the way we go about teaching and instruction? Not just to do a better job with 22 kids and more dynamic case studies and more dynamic, all of which is great. Believe me, I'm the last guy in the world to frown on any of this. I'm an old high school teacher. But again, that serves a population of students. That's not all of our students. That's certainly not mid-career students. That's certainly not night professional students. So how do we think about instructional and pedagogical and assessment approaches that are going to meet the needs of the students we're dealing with? And final point, what's this mean for you guys? And I'll take questions. 3 things I would just suggest off the top of my head. 1, encourage your students to look at higher education as an area for them to apply their skills and know-how. Huge unexploited opportunities. This is something where we haven't yet frittered away our natural international advantages, where we have huge assets in play. It's going to be a massive growth industry going forward. It's not a bad opportunity. Second, I was walking through here before, and I just saw some of the terrific stuff, some of the terrific, work and the case studies and the rest of it. But let's bring not only kind of that same kind of creativity to campus roles and thinking about entrepreneurship and to teaching about entrepreneurship, but bring that back to your provost's office. Find opportunities to help them not just rethink how do we do cross-campus collaboration, but how do we bring your know-how to pricing models, to assumptions about online delivery, to what a teaching job should look like, to who tenure is appropriate for, to what kinds of individuals ought to be hired. And third, for yourselves, think about higher ed just as an area of inquiry. Some of the research that just got rewarded this morning. Bring those same set of skills and those same set of lenses and think about what is it that characterizes dynamic efforts in higher ed, where are the obstacles to reinvention, and how do we get from here to there? With that, let's open it up. Thanks. Or not. Yes, sir. Yeah, no, I think that you're exactly right. So in particular, this raises the question of, giving, giving how wildly costs vary of doing different kinds of education well, and given the resistance both culturally and kind of in practice at institutions. How do you get around this? And I think that's exactly right. This is the old, and in some ways it's kind of the old skunk works question, right? It's the same reason that, that it's so incredibly difficult for any of the legacy airlines ever to have spun off a low-cost alternative. And whenever they've tried these, low-cost solutions, they've constantly had these internal cultural struggles with the pilots and everything else about the contracts. And I think, I'm not sure there's any way to really reinvent these things within a conventional established university, because the nature of faculty governance is that tenured faculty are the folks that sit in the faculty senate and the folks who are going to weigh in on this, and they're going to be immovable, and they are profoundly uncomfortable with these kinds of changes. And similarly, their expectations as to what's fair and equitable costing of courses is just baked into long-established campus practice. The notion that we're going to do an internal market where it's $15,000 for this course for experiential entrepreneurship and $873 for English 1 is just going to be incredibly difficult to sell at any campus I've spent time at. So I think one of the answers here, and this takes us back exactly to the entrepreneurship question, is whether or not the institutional forms that we're used to are well suited for these challenges. So that raises two opportunities. One is, are there ways to do skunk works at the university, not just new campus centers and not just multidisciplinary operations, but cleave them off, the old kind of 1970s incubator stuff. And that was a miserable failure in its own right, but that's just because it was a bad idea. But that kind of model of relationship, where you have an association, but where you're operating on a right target, the target model, where you actually have an institutional entity that is free to rethink some of this stuff and price differently and hire differently. Or two, are there opportunities for faculty to raise philanthropic dollars or raise public dollars to go off and actually start greenfield institutions, which are going to be simply new higher ed institutions that are going to look different, feel different, and taste different from the ones that we've so long known. Yes, sir. Yes, the accrediting regime is nuts. On the other, right, it's a classic. Right, it's a classic input-driven regime. And one of the things we know about input regulation is that it's a death knell for reinvention and for entrepreneurship. That's just the way it works. On the other hand, there's two things here that are going on. One is folks like Bisque Education and Straighter Line have actually found some opportunities to end run that. One, what they found is institutions which are willing to lend their accreditation to these new providers because these are generally less prestigious institutions looking for bodies and looking to get in the game. The second is that sometimes you can exploit opportunities among accreditors. So, for instance, I forget which regional body it was, but Straighter Line actually managed to get accredited by somebody, despite the fact that it's this completely virtual delivery. The second piece here, of course, is federal policy, which can create more or less room when it comes to accreditation. There's just two quick things on the table right now that I think raise concerns on this count. On the whole, the Obama administration is staffed with people I know and like who are thoughtful about this. So you'd like to think that they were sensitive to these issues. But one, in the student lending bill, for instance, there's $500 million to have the federal government start purchasing and offering online courses, which could really just brutalize the political economy of the sector. And second, they're actually thinking about increasing the seat time requirements for virtual education, which kind of goes the opposite way of making it possible for folks to rethink. So I think there's a huge set at the state and federal level of public policy questions, including accreditation.
Frederick, thank you very much. Could you stay just one moment? These are all incredibly important issues for all of us, and thank you for helping us start this dialogue, launch our conferences with this dialogue. On behalf of USASBE, I'd like to thank you for being our keynote speaker, and we have a small gift for you.